What if I told you the internet isn't asking what happened anymore? It's asking why she looks so calm. Yeah, that question. Overnight, social media timelines lit up with one viral headline after another. Joe Rogan left stunned, body language expert breaks the silence, nothing adds up, and suddenly, a hypothetical narrative took on a life of its own because, according to the internet, the same internet that once solved crimes from a couch, Regina King's reactions after the death of Malcolm Jamal Warner don't look like what people expect grief to look like. Too composed, too energetic, too focused, or so they say. And then came the podcasts, the clips, the slow motion replays, a raised eyebrow here, a half-second smile there. Freeze frames labeled "Explain This," enter a so-called body language expert, and suddenly Joe Rogan's name gets dragged into the algorithm like gasoline on a fire. Shock reactions, interesting questions, just asking questions, right? But here's the twist. None of this is proven. No facts, no confirmations. Just speculation, interpretation, and a public that's addicted to turning emotion into evidence. So the real question isn't what's true. It's why do we need a villain so badly, even in a hypothetical story? Stay with me, because this is where the internet stops whispering and starts accusing. The names are real, the emotions are real, but what you're about to hear exists entirely in the messy space between internet opinion and imagination. Because in this story, the so-called scandal didn't begin with evidence, police reports, or courtroom drama. It began with a pause, a smile, a moment that someone clipped, reposted, slowed down, zoomed in on, and decided meant something more. After the death of Malcolm Jamal Warner, the public didn't wait for facts. The timeline didn't pause for context. Instead, people started watching Regina King the way the internet always does when it thinks it's smarter than grief itself. Every interview became a test. Every appearance became a performance review. Was she crying enough? Was she crying too much? Why is she working already? Why is she smiling? Why does she look composed? Why doesn't she look how I think someone should look? And that's where the narrative quietly shifted from mourning to suspicion. Online creators started framing it differently. Not how is she coping, but why is she coping like that? Podcasts ran long episodes dissecting tone, posture, timing. Comment sections filled with armchair psychologists who suddenly spoke fluent body language theory after watching 3 TikToks and half of a YouTube short. And the more people talked, the more the story stopped being about loss and started being about interpretation. Someone somewhere labeled it first. Just 2 words. Happy widow. It was sarcastic. Then it was repeated. Then it was quoted without sarcasm. Then it was treated like an observation instead of an insult. And once that phrase took off, the algorithm did what it always does. It fed the outrage back to the people most likely to amplify it. This hypothetical controversy didn't need proof. It needed pattern making. So people began creating patterns out of fragments. A clip of Regina laughing at a charity event weeks later. A photo of her on set, looking focused, professional, composed. A quote taken out of context where she talked about moving forward, and suddenly those fragments were stitched together into something that looked like a narrative if you squinted hard enough. Then came the experts, not doctors, not clinicians, self-described body language analysts with ring lights and confident voices. They pointed to hand placement, eye movement, micro-expressions that may or may not exist outside the imagination of the viewer. One said her smile lingered too long. Another said her posture showed control, not sorrow. Another paused a video frame and asked, "Do grieving people look like this?" And just like that, the commentary escalated from opinion to implication. What made it more explosive was how often Joe Rogan's name got pulled into the conversation. Not because he made accusations, not because he endorsed anything, but because in this fictional narrative, clips circulated of him reacting the way he always does when something feels off to him, curious, skeptical, asking questions without giving answers. And in the attention economy, a raised eyebrow is enough to fuel 10 headlines. Joe Rogan stunned, Joe Rogan reacts. Joe Rogan questions the official story. None of those headlines needed him to say much. The suggestion was enough. And once his name entered the chat, the tone changed. What was once gossip became discussion. What was once speculation became investigation. Creators framed their videos like exposes, using dramatic music, ominous pauses, and phrases like connect the dots and what they don't want you to notice, even though there was no they, and nothing concrete being hidden. The irony is that the same videos would occasionally admit, almost as a legal whisper, that grief looks different for everyone, that trauma doesn't follow a script, that some people cope by staying busy, by working, by appearing strong in public and falling apart in private. But those admissions never made the thumbnails. They never made the titles. They never went viral. What went viral was doubt. People began rewriting Regina King's public history through this new lens. Old interviews were re-examined. Past confidence was reframed as calculation. Professional discipline was rebranded as emotional distance. The narrative didn't ask whether these interpretations were fair. It asked whether they were clickable, and because this is a hypothetical story about the internet, the comments became louder than the facts. Some viewers demanded answers that no one owed them. Others defended her fiercely, pointing out how cruel it is to police grief. But the algorithm doesn't reward balance. It rewards tension. So the tension grew. Creators started hinting at inconsistencies without ever naming them clearly. Something doesn't add up, they'd say, without explaining what. People close to the situation are saying things privately without naming anyone. Sources claim without sources. The language was vague enough to avoid responsibility, but strong enough to keep viewers watching. In this imagined scandal, there were no actual accusations, just the constant suggestion that there could be something more. And that suggestion was enough to keep the story alive. By the time viewers reached the end of those videos, they weren't convinced of guilt. They were convinced of mystery. And mystery is more powerful than truth on the internet, because truth has limits. Mystery has infinite rewrites, and as the speculation looped endlessly, one uncomfortable reality emerged. The story was no longer about Malcolm Jamal Warner at all. It wasn't about honoring a life. It wasn't even about Regina King as a person. It was about how quickly grief can be turned into content, and how easily composure can be mistaken for coldness when people are desperate for a plot twist, and just when it seemed like the narrative had reached its peak. When the audience thought the questions couldn't get louder, the story didn't stop. It leaned in further, shifting from reactions to so-called revelations, from observation to accusation-adjacent insinuation, and from online chatter to something framed as a full-blown unraveling that was only just beginning as the conversation moved forward into what people claimed to be the deeper breakdown, where unnamed insiders alleged inconsistencies and amplified theories started taking center stage, and the tone of the discourse darkened, even more as part 2 began without pause. What happened next in this hypothetical narrative was predictable and yet somehow more aggressive. Once the audience had been trained to doubt appearances, the internet demanded escalation. Simple observation was no longer enough. People wanted details. They wanted explanations. They wanted something that felt like insider knowledge, even if it wasn't. So creators began introducing what they called background context, which was really just recycled rumors dressed up as revelations. Anonymous sources suddenly appeared everywhere. A friend of a friend, a former associate, someone who was close to the situation but didn't want to go on record. These invisible voices all seemed to agree on one thing: the official story felt incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete. And that distinction mattered because it allowed speculation to flourish without ever having to prove anything. One podcast claimed there were timeline gaps no one had explained. They never said what those gaps were, just that they existed. Another video suggested there were conversations behind the scenes that contradicted public statements, but conveniently couldn't share them. Viewers were encouraged to read between the lines, even though the lines themselves were imaginary. Then came the dramatic pivot to lifestyle analysis. In this fictional breakdown, people started tracking Regina King's movements like she was a stock market, who she was seen with, what events she attended, how quickly she returned to work. There were whispers about expensive trips, high-profile meetings, luxury settings that were framed not as professional obligations, but as suspicious timing. The implication was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. The visuals did the work. Creators would say things like, "I'm not saying this means anything, but look at this," and then pause long enough for the audience to do the accusing for them. Screenshots were zoomed in on. Dates were circled in red. Ordinary schedules were treated like coded messages. The narrative slowly shifted from emotional analysis to lifestyle scrutiny, as if success itself needed to be justified in the aftermath of loss. Public reactions followed the familiar split. Some commenters applauded her strength. Others accused her of moving on too fast. The phrase "if it were me" showed up everywhere, as if personal imagination was a valid measuring stick for someone else's trauma. People projected their own version of grief onto someone they'd never met, and then judged her for not following it. In this hypothetical world, even silence became suspicious. When Regina didn't address the rumors directly, that was framed as avoidance. When she did speak publicly about resilience and healing, that was framed as rehearsed. There was no winning because the story had stopped being about her actions and started being about the audience's expectations, and just when the commentary risked burning itself out. The narrative found new fuel, leaked materials that no one could verify, screenshots of alleged messages with names blurred out, claims of internal disagreements, hints of tensions that were never specified. Each leak was introduced with disclaimers, but the disclaimers were whispered while the accusations were shouted. This is where Joe Rogan's shadow loomed larger in the discourse. Again, not because he accused anyone, but because his brand of curiosity was reframed as validation. Clips circulated where he talked generally about human behavior, about how people respond to trauma differently, about how sometimes public narratives don't match private realities. Those general observations were stitched next to this story as if they were commentary on it. Even when they weren't, headlines did the rest. Joe Rogan raises eyebrows. Joe Rogan questions body language analysis. Joe Rogan reacts to viral claims. None of these headlines required context. They required clicks. And they got them. Meanwhile, self-appointed analysts doubled down. They dissected interviews frame by frame. They compared Regina's reactions in different settings and declared inconsistencies where none were proven. One claimed her laugh sounded forced. Another claimed her pauses were too measured. Another argued that grief should be messy, not composed, as if emotional chaos were the only acceptable form of authenticity. The counter-arguments were there, but they were quieter. Mental health professionals tried to explain that trauma can produce hyperfunctionality, that some people cope by staying productive, that public figures often compartmentalize to survive. But those explanations didn't trend. They didn't come with ominous music or dramatic thumbnails. So the latter narrative won. At this stage in the hypothetical story, the audience was no longer being asked what they thought. They were being told what to suspect. Words like red flags became common, even though no one could define them clearly. The story had developed its own internal logic. If something feels off, it must be off. And if it must be off, then searching for proof becomes a form of entertainment rather than a responsibility. Some creators took it further, suggesting that powerful people always know how to control perception, that media training equals manipulation, that professionalism equals concealment. These claims were never tied to specific evidence, but they resonated with viewers who already distrusted public narratives. And so, in this imagined media storm, speculation transformed into certainty for some viewers. Not legal certainty, emotional certainty. The kind that doesn't require proof, only repetition. Once enough people say the same thing, it begins to feel real, even if it isn't. What made this phase particularly unsettling was how easily grief was reframed as strategy. Strength was recast as calculation. Privacy was reframed as secrecy. And the absence of visible suffering was treated as a moral failure rather than a personal boundary. All the while, Malcolm Jamal Warner's name continued to fade into the background. He became less a person and more a plot device. The story wasn't about his life or legacy. It was about the spectacle built around his absence. By the end of this section of the narrative, the audience had been led to believe they were watching something unravel. That more was coming. That the next reveal would finally explain why things didn't feel right. The creators promised deeper dives, more leaks, bigger reactions. And just as the speculation reached a fever pitch, the conversation took another turn, moving away from analysis and toward imagined consequences, where people began asking not just what might be hidden, but what might happen next. As the hypothetical fallout began to dominate the discourse without any break as the script flowed directly into this video. As the hypothetical discourse shifted into its final phase, the language grew heavier, more dramatic, and more final, even though nothing concrete had actually changed. Now, the question being pushed wasn't what people thought, but what they believed should happen next. The internet, having appointed itself judge and jury, began to speculate about consequences. As if speculation alone could trigger outcomes, some creators started talking about pressure building behind the scenes, not pressure from courts or officials, but pressure from public opinion, advertisers, studios, and audiences. In this imagined storyline, unnamed executives were supposedly watching closely. Anonymous insiders were said to be concerned about optics. No names, no documents, just the suggestion that whispers were turning into worries. Videos began asking whether projects could be delayed, rebranded, or quietly shelved. Not because of facts, but because controversy itself is treated like a liability. The idea floated around that in today's climate, perception can be just as damaging as proof. Again, nothing confirmed, nothing cited, but repeated enough times to feel plausible. Then came the talk of investigations. Not real investigations, but the internet's favorite kind, hypothetical ones. Commentators speculated about whether authorities would feel public pressure to re-examine timelines, revisit statements, or clarify unanswered questions. They framed it as accountability rather than accusation, even though no new information had emerged. The phrase at minimum did a lot of work here, allowing people to demand action without specifying why. Others pushed back, arguing that this was exactly how misinformation spreads. That asking for investigations without cause erodes trust. That turning grief into suspicion sets a dangerous precedent. But those voices were often drowned out by the louder narrative that something this viral couldn't possibly be nothing. Joe Rogan's name continued to be invoked, almost ritualistically, not as an authority, but as a symbol. In this fictional arc, people framed him as the stand-in for the curious everyman, the one supposedly brave enough to question narratives. Even when he hadn't commented directly, his reputation for long-form questioning was used to legitimize the discussion. If Joe Rogan is even thinking about it, some would say, maybe there's more there. That logic didn't require Joe Rogan's participation. It only required his image. Meanwhile, Regina King, the actual human at the center of this storm, remained mostly silent in this imagined version of events. And that silence became the final Rorschach test. To supporters, it was dignity. To critics, it was avoidance. To content creators, it was empty space to be filled with theory. Some videos began predicting apologies that hadn't happened. Others predicted statements that hadn't been written. A few even speculated about potential retreats from the public eye, as if withdrawal were an admission rather than a coping mechanism. The future was being scripted in advance, regardless of reality. What's striking about this hypothetical ending is how little it relies on new information. By this point, the narrative feeds entirely on itself. Past clips are replayed. Old quotes are recycled. Reactions to reactions become the content. The story no longer needs facts, because it has momentum. And that momentum is fueled by certainty without evidence. By the belief that feeling uneasy is the same as knowing something is wrong. by the assumption that public figures owe the public emotional performances that match audience expectations. In the final stretch of this imagined saga, a few creators step back and try to sound reflective. They talk about how the internet can go too far, how grief is not a template, how speculation can become cruelty. But even these moments are framed dramatically, as if self-awareness itself were a part of the show. Because the truth is, there is no clean resolution to a story built entirely on interpretation. No reveal that satisfies everyone. No ending that ties things up neatly. The audience is left not with answers, but with amplified questions and the uncomfortable realization that the controversy existed mostly because people wanted it to. In this hypothetical world, no charges are filed, no hidden documents emerge, no definitive proof appears. What remains is a case study in how quickly narratives can spiral, how easily strength can be misread, and how platforms reward suspicion more than empathy. The final takeaway isn't about Regina King, or Joe Rogan, or even Malcolm Jamal Warner as individuals. It's about the ecosystem that turns pauses into proof, composure into controversy, and speculation into spectacle. It's about how the demand for constant content can strip nuance from human experience, and as the comments continue to argue, defend, accuse, and question, the story doesn't actually end. It just fades, slowly replaced by the next viral mystery, the next face to analyze, the next moment to misinterpret, because in the attention economy, closure is boring, uncertainty is profitable. And as long as people keep watching, clicking, and asking questions without waiting for answers, stories like this will keep being written, rewritten, and recycled long after the people involved have moved on, leaving behind a digital echo where opinion once again pretends to be investigation. So now it's your turn to decide what this story really is. Is it a case of the internet asking reasonable questions, or another example of how quickly curiosity turns into accusation when there's a vacuum of certainty? Did people genuinely see red flags? Or did they simply project their own expectations of grief onto someone they don't know and will never fully understand? Ask yourself this: when did observation become evidence? And when did interpretation start feeling like truth? If strength looks suspicious and silence looks guilty, what does that say about the culture watching from the sidelines? And if this narrative made you uncomfortable, was it because something felt exposed? Or because it showed how easily we participate in these cycles without realizing it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the reactions were overblown, or do you believe questions are always justified, no matter how speculative? Was this a harmless discussion, or did it cross a line into something darker? If you want more deep dives into how viral controversies are constructed, dissected, and monetized in real time, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next shocking revelation is already loading into the algorithm, and you don't want to miss how the story gets told before anyone asks whether it should have been told at all.